The Radio Planet by Ralph Milne Farley. Chapter 24, The Lobsteroid Circuit. Miles could not help comparing his present ease of passage down the swath cut by the Cupians with his difficult grubbing through the shrubs a few feet for an hour, or even the forcing of his way behind the wedge-faced insect. Upon his arrival at the brink of the abyss, his first act was to test the black sand with an electric coil. As he expected, it was magnetite, the only iron ore which will respond to a magnet. It was the same ore as he had used in his crucibles while making his radio set in Verkini. This preliminary disposed of, cables were quickly stretched back and forth across the pit, and then from these cables large electromagnets were hung close to the surface of the water. Wires were run from the lighting system and nearby town to a master controller at the top of the cliff. When all was in readiness, the Earthman threw the current into all the circuits. The result was immediate. To the surface of the water there floated from the bottom side up a score or more of lobster-like creatures, each the size of a freight car. Poor beasts! The pellets of sand and cement in the cavities of their gravity-sense organs were composed of magnetite, and this, being attracted upward by the suspended electromagnets, gave the poor creatures the impression that up was down and down was up. Consequently, reversing their position and floating to the surface, they imagined, with what little imagination their primitive brains were capable of, that they were resting peacefully at the bottom of their lake. Next, there were turned on, in place of suspended magnets, a number of magnets lying against the steep side of the pit, where the surface of the water, and instantly all the lobsteroids rolled over and with their bellies toward that side of the pit. The experiment was a complete success. Grappling hooks and blocks and tackle were then brought, and the dragging was begun for the airplane, the anti-rifle, and the bandolier of cartridges which Miles had lost the night of his landing in Cuba. The radio man himself, stationed at his switchboard, manipulated the instruments. Presumably all three of the sought articles were near the bank where the Cabot had landed, so fishing was begun at that point, while energized magnets across the pond drew the huge crustaceans away. Even so, several of them swam back and snapped at the grappling hooks. This gave Miles an opportunity to practice his controls. Whenever one of the monsters in the deep would approach any of the dredging apparatus, the radio man would close a switch which controlled some nearby magnet, whereat the bewildered beast would be thrown completely off his balance and would require several parapars before he could orientate himself to the new lines of force. By the time that this had been accomplished, Cabot would have switched on some other magnet, thus again upsetting the beast's equilibrium. It was truly a weird, novel tune, which this electrical genius of two worlds played upon the keyboard, while huge green shapes moved at his command. Finally, Miles got so expert at this strange game that it became safe for his workmen to descend into the pit without fear of the denizens of the deep. At last the ropes were securely fastened to the ant-plane, and it was drawn up to the bank and up to safety. The firearm and ammunition followed shortly thereafter. The forces of the true king, Baby Q, were now armed with one small airship, one rifle, and one bandolier of cartridges. "You must attack at once," Nan asserted. The Earthman looked at the Cupian in surprise. "Why?" he asked. "Because," the young cleric explained, "if you don't, some one of this village is going to get word to Prince Uri of your return. Although no announcement has yet been made of your identity, this feat of yours of overcoming the scissor beast is as good as a verbal introduction. Runners will soon be notifying the usurper." "Why runners?" Miles asked. "Why not radio?" "Because," Nan replied, "I took the precaution to throw an adjusting tool into the locomotor generator set early this morning. One of the solenoids is hopelessly jammed, and so it will take several days and nights of steady work to ever restore it." "Great are the ramifications of the lost religion," Cabot murmured approvingly. But the young cleric pouted in spite of the tone of approval. Said he, "There were no ramifications to this accomplishment. I did it all myself." "Have it your own way," Miles returned, consolatory. "But to get back to what we were discussing, how am I to attack the usurper with no troops and but only one plane and one rifle?" "But you must attack," Nan objected. "As for planes, every plane in the kingdom, save only for yours, is under lock and key at the Watusa, the old naval air base, which is now the headquarters of the Whistling Bees. Every firearm save two, your rifle and Prince Yuri's automatic, is under heavy guard at Kuana Arsenal. Only the Pretender himself and the Arsenal guards, who are trusted henchmen of his, are permitted to be armed. And I suppose, the Earthman interjected, with a shrug, that you expect me alone, with a single-handedly, to seize the Kuana arsenal and distribute arms to my people? Not exactly, the priest replied. You see, at which point the conversation was interrupted by a body of troops, four abreast, which came marching toward them and down the aisle, which had been cut through the trees. Cabot stepped back in aghast. Trapped! The soldiers swung along in a perfect cadence which had been taught to them by generations spent in marching clubs, or hundreds of Cupia. True, they were unarmed, but what could one armed human do against such numbers? Cabot glanced down the path and saw hundreds of hundreds turn into it after further end. There was only one possibility of escape, his plane, but the plane was still dripping from the submergence in the pond. Would its tawful engine start while wet? Had enough water leaked into the alcohol tanks to damage the fuel? He would have to see. Shouting to Nan-Nan and Emsul to follow, he started toward the craft, but the young cleric blocked his way. Treachery? No, for the young priest cried, Fear not, defender of the faith, these are friends. They are the armies which you had led against Yuri. They are marching clubs of loyal hill towns, which have been called together here, ostensibly for the athletic tournament. Cabot stopped his mad scramble of retreat and smiled. With such men he could reconquer Cupia, Yuri or no Yuri, bees or no bees. The foremost hundred debouched and formed into a company front. Then from the ranks there stepped a Cupian, who snatched off his blond wig, revealing ruddy locks beneath. Onto his own right breast he pinned a red circle, the insignia of field marshal. It was Ha-Baba, chief of staff of the armies of Cupia, who had been Cabot's right-hand man in the two wars of liberation. Facing the troops, he gave a crisp command. Up shot every left hand. Then, wheeling about, he held his own hand aloft and shouted, Yahoo! Miles Cabot! We're ready to follow you wherever you lead. Yahoo! The troops echoed in unison. Then, giving his men the order at ease, Ha strode up to the Earthman. Warmly, the two friends patted each other on the cheek. It was many saints since they had seen each other, and much had happened in the meantime. A council of war was immediately held between Miles, Ha, Nan-Nan, and Emsul at the plain. Won't this gathering come to the attention of Yuri? Miles asked. And won't he at once suspect its cause in view of the nearness to Luno Castle, in view of my recent radio announcements from Verkingi? I doubt it, the Baba replied, for we have wrecked every radio set in the vicinity. But this did not reassure the Earthman as much as it might. It would seem to me, he asserted, that this very fact would also put Prince Yuri on his guard. Possibly so, Nan-Nan ruefully admitted, but it will take 4 days for investigators to cover thousands of stads from Kuana to here by Kirkwall, 2 days by bee. And in the meantime, Miles countered, it will take our plane 2 days to reach Kuana, and our Kirkwalls 4. Then, Emsul suggested, had we not better march openly and at once? This suggestion was accepted with reservation, however, that the return of Cabot and the existence of their plane were to be kept a secret as long as possible. Accordingly, the main body of the troops were put on the march toward Kuana, under Emsul, with the instructions to requisition every available Kirkwall, wreck every radio set, and place every settlement under martial law. The Kirkwalls, as fast as seized, were to be manned by the best sharpshooters and sent ahead. The local village and the lobster pond were placed under heavy guard, and the Earthman and his plane and rifle remained under cover. That night, just at sunset, he started forth. The airship had been stripped to the lightest, and in it were crowded Miles Cabot, Ha-Baba, Nan-Nan, and half a dozen sharpshooters. Long before morning they came up to the lights of the foremost of the Kirkwalls, and so were forced to cease their advance, whereupon they landed and encamped for the rest of the night and the following day. All day long Kirkwalls passed them on the road, stopping to report as they passed. Apparently a surprising number of these swift two-wheeled Porovian autos had been captured. The following night the plane again took wing and continued until it caught up once again with the advance guard of the taxicab army. These men reported that the last radio station seized, they had learned that Prince Yuri had put censorship on the air, thus showing conclusively that the usurper had learned something of what was going on. Then the Kirkwall swept ahead and Cabot encamped as before. He was now halfway to Quana, his loved ones, and his Prince Uri. Toward the end of the day which followed, the advancing Kurkals met a bombing squadron of whistling bees and were forced to halt and take cover as best they could. Most of the men escaped, but many of the machines had to be left on the road, where they were demolished by the bombs of the enemy. During all this confusion, a Kurkal from the capital, bearing cross sticks and a flag of truce, drew up at the vanguard with the following message: King Uri cannot but regard the steady procession of Kurkals toward Quana as a menace directed against him. If it is not so intended, then let a delegation in one Kurkal proceed under cross sticks to convince him of your sincerity. From now on, if more than one Kurkal advances, it will be taken as a hostile act, and Prince Q, the heir to the throne, will be sacrificed as a hostage. Upon receiving this message, Sol at once directed the followers to stay where they were until Miles Cabot could catch up with them. Then, with a picked body of men, in one Kurkal, under cross sticks, he took up the road toward Quana, preceded by delegation which was brought the message to Uri. Not a word would he give them as to the purpose of the advance. Your message was from Prince Uri, he said, and therefore to Prince Uri shall be the reply. But it does seem a bit thoughtless of the Himerians to drop bombs on our men before even attempting to ascertain whether or not our advance was intended to be peaceful. To this they in turn made no answer. About midnight, Miles Cabot, in his airplane, reached the point where the Kurkals had halted. He found the Cupians confused and more or less leaderless. He, as they, was horrified at the threat which the usurper Uri held over the head of the little king. But while he and Nan and Hababa were contemplating on this situation, word was brought in by a party who had just demolished a nearby radio set that they had picked the following unaddressed and unsigned message out of the air: Fear not, Baby Q has been kidnapped from the palace and is safe. Somehow this news carried conviction. The longer they considered it, the more authentic it appeared. Certainly it could not have emanated from Uri, for he could have no possible object in deceiving them into thinking that the little king was safe, and thus encouraging them to proceed with whatever they might have had afoot. But they could not imagine who was their informant. It might be any one of a number of leaders in Cabot's two wars of liberation: Poblath, the philosopher, Mango of the Quana jail, Jababa, Oyeba, Ba Tedin, professors at the Royal University, Count Kamel of the Kitith, the ex-radical, or even the loyal Prince Toron, Uri's younger brother, whom Cabot had left in charge as regent upon embarking on his ill-fated visit to Earth. All these loyal Cupians had been driven into hiding when the renegade Uri had returned across the boiling seas and had usurped the throne with the aid of the Himerians. Where they were now, no one knew. This message might be from any one of them, or it might not. Anyhow, it served to hearten Cabot and his two companies. Said Miles, undoubtedly there were some of Uri's Cupian henchmen on the backs of the bees which bombed our Kurkals. These they have probably reported by wireless that our advance is stopped. I do not believe that Uri yet knows that we have a plane. Accordingly, he will not expect immediate trouble so long as the vanguard remains here, 400 stads from Quana. You, Hababa, remain here in charge of our troops. I seriously doubt if the usurper will attack you, for he does not dare trust enough Cupians with rifles for the purpose. Nan and I and our sharpshooters will proceed as rapidly as possible in the plain until daybreak. Then we will encamp as usual. Tomorrow afternoon send scouts ahead to destroy the wireless and start your whole Kurkal army on the move at sunset. Bend every effort to join me as soon as possible at the capital, where I expect to arrive sometime tomorrow night. Beyond that, I have no definite plans. May the great builder speed our cause. Then he said goodnight, and took off once more in his plane, and as he soared aloft with his noisy troffle motor, Earthmen would have heard it for stads in every direction. But these Cupians were earless, and hence possessed no sense of hearing as we know it. The noisy plane could have made no impression upon their antenna sense, for its engines being of the Toffel variety, or diesel as we call a somewhat similar device on Earth, has no electrical ignition. Throughout the remainder of the night, the plane sped forward, deviating from its course only when whistling sounds warned them of the presence of the bees. With the first faint tinge of pink in the east, they landed and hid the airship at the edge of the wood, 260 stads from Quana. A small town lay nearby. To it went several of the crew in search of food and information, while the rest took turns guarding the plane and sleeping. During Cabot's turn at watch, he noted a figure slinking across a neighboring field. There was something strangely familiar about this figure, so Miles hid himself in a tartan bush and awaited its approach. It walked with a peculiar limp, very much like that which he had characterized Ba-Teden ever since he had recovered from the shell wound which he had received at the Second War of Liberation. But the face and the hair of the approaching Cupian bore no resemblance to Professor Tedin. Nevertheless, Cabot took a chance. Stepping suddenly from his place in concealment, he shouted, "Ba-Teden!" Thereat the Cupian emitted a shriek of terror from his antenna and started running away across the fields. "Stop!" the Earthman called, "for I am Miles Cabot." The fleeing man halted abruptly and peered at Miles inquisitively. Then he smiled and snatched off his wig and straightened out his expression. It was none other than Ba-Teden. "So, you are the cause of all the rumpus," the ejaculated, returning and patting his friend warmly upon the cheek. "What rumpus?" Miles inquired with interest. "Wireless won't work," the other replied, "and no messages on the air anyhow. Nothing but bees. The air is full of them anyhow, so full of vague rumors of all sorts. As Poblath would say, where there's wind, there will be a storm." "Speaking of Poblath," Miles said, "where is the philosopher?" "Quana, the last I heard," Ba-Teden replied. "Jababa and oyed are somewhere in the west. Prince Toron has disappeared completely. Ha-Baba and Em-Sul were supposed to be in the northern part of the Okars Mountains. Kemel Bar-Sarkar has gone over to Uri. I am here. That about completes the list of our former leaders. Ha-Baba is in charge of my unarmed forces, 160 stads north from here," Cabot answered. "Em-Sul is on his way to Uri under cross sticks. I am here in a plane with one rifle, Nan the cleric, and 6 unarmed sharpshooters." "What is the idea?" Teden asked. "The idea is to fly to Quana tonight," the Earthman replied, "and raise as much roughhouse as possible for Prince Uri. Will you come with us? There is a vacant place in the plane." The Cupian looked at him admiringly and said, "You are still the same old Miles Cabot. You propose to capture Quana practically without arms and single-handed, and the joke is you will probably succeed. How do you do it?" "It's a gift," Miles laughed, "but trees have antennae, as the Poblath would say. Let us proceed to the plane and wait for evening." At the plane, Cabot awakened one of the Cupians to take his place on guard. Then, in low tones, he and Ba-Teden each related to each other all that occurred since the matter-transmitting apparatus shot the radio man earthward. Along toward the night, the absentees returned from the village, bringing provision, but scarcely any news except that the place was seething with suppressed excitement, and that they had succeeded in getting into the radio station and pieing the apparatus. "Let us start then at once," Ba-Teden counseled. "No one can now get word to Uri, and perhaps they will mistake us for a Hymenarian. Anyhow," but impatient as he was, Miles would hear none of this. "They can easily dispatch a runner to some nearby town to send a message from there," he said. "Furthermore, a plane looks very little like a whistling bee." So the group feasted and waited until the last streaks of the red had died in the west, before they shot into the air and southward. The plane was driven to its utmost, but it was later than 1 o'clock at night before the lights of Quana loomed ahead. Turning to the right, Cabot skirted the city and landed near the arsenal. Nan promptly left them. "I have church affairs to attend to," he explained. "Great are the ramifications of the lost religion," the Earthman replied, laughing, "and I hope that you pick up some useful information." After the young cleric had gone, Ba-Teden asked, "Surely you don't plan for us to attack the arsenal? It's heavily guarded by the only men whom Uri permits to carry firearms in the entire kingdom."